with a compelling perspective on global politics. This is the Patrick Henningsen Show on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, sitting in for Patrick today, Wednesday, the 24th of July, 2024. Apologies for the slight delay to the start of the program due to technical problems, but we're up and running now. And what a day it is. Extraordinary events over on the other side of the pond. Huge protest in Washington at the mass murderer Benjamin Netanyahu giving a speech to Congress. All power to them. I wish I could be there with them. I'm glad to see so many people on the streets of Washington. He shouldn't be addressing Congress. He should be in jail. Meanwhile, the Republicans already begun attacking Kamala Harris. She's not in Congress for the speech. That, of course, has drawn criticism from the ultra-Israel fanatics. She's at a prearranged engagement in Indianapolis talking to a lot of college girls. Very interesting to see what she says. But already they're attacking her. Unsurprisingly, Donald Trump has launched a legal challenge to her inheriting the funds from the Biden campaign. And Representative Andy Ogles has introduced articles of impeachment because of her gross incompetence when handling the border. It really has been the most extraordinary couple of weeks in American politics that anyone can remember, going all the way back to November 1963. But we're going to focus on this side of the pond for the next quarter of an hour or so with Professor Glenn Diesen. Glenn is eminently qualified as professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and associate editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal, his main speciality being Russian foreign policy and geoeconomics. Welcome to the program, Glenn. Europe in crisis as well. I mean, I don't think it's overstating the case to say that the crisis inside the EU, caused almost entirely by the freewheeling antics, the self-styled peacemaking initiative by Viktor Orban, has provoked absolutely boiling rage among the Eurocrats, the warmongers, and they're going to rob Hungary of some of the privileges it would normally enjoy when president of the council.
That's correct. Well, Hungary holds the rotating EU presidency, but as we now see, Hungary, they're not even allowed now to host this strategic EU meeting next month. And the reason is the EU is looking for a way to punish Hungary. And the great crime committed by Orban was to pursue diplomacy. That is, he flew to Ukraine, and then he went to Moscow, he went to Beijing, and he even went to the US and met with Trump. And they've been looking or discussing ways to, map out the competing interests and demands and, try to figure out if there's any diplomatic solution to this conflict. Now, the EU is obviously outraged. The EU labels itself a peace project, but as we now see, not only is it committed only to war, that is, it only sees victory on the battlefield as a possible solution to this conflict, but even for Hungary to go and talk to the competing sides, to talk to the Ukrainians and the Russians and try to find a diplomatic solution, even this is being punished. It's quite extraordinary. It's obvious that the EU has not wanted to do any diplomacy with the Russians. They rejected all negotiations. They sabotaged the negotiations the Ukrainians had. But now they're going to punish one of their own EU members for attempting to even do diplomacy.
It's extremely disappointing, the standard of debate in Europe and among Democrats in Washington is that any form of diplomacy is now appeasement. That's a very puerile, simplistic way of looking at things. If that was the case, why bother with diplomats at all? Why doesn't everybody just close all their embassies straight away and go straight to war? It's embarrassing, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, Glenn, that this is what international relations have descended to.
Yeah, this is the problem with this silly Hitler analogy, which always comes forth, because if you assume that your adversary is another Hitler, and every time we go to war, we pretend to fight another Hitler, the problem then is that, as you mentioned, all diplomacy gets labeled appeasement. And the only way you can have peace is by defeating your adversary. So you reject diplomacy. And this is a wider problem we had, not just in Europe, but across the political West, that the diplomacy has, I would say, largely collapsed over the past 30 years. In the past, diplomacy meant, you meet with your adversaries, you map out where you can agree, where your differences are, and the possibility of finding compromise, putting yourself in the shoes of the other. Diplomacy in the past 30 years meant something very different. It means that the West effectively is a teacher, and it should civilize its students. So diplomacy means to take a pedagogic role of either punishing or rewarding other states for towing the line and doing as they're told. So it's we don't really do diplomacy the way it used to be done, at least. So, and it's hard to put words on how catastrophic this new policies of the European Union is.
I couldn't agree with you more. And what's more, it seems the European Union refused to engage with the meat and potatoes of the problem. I was talking to Johnny H., one of the very few journalists in the Donbass. He was reporting on the deaths of several Russian/Ukrainian civilians as a result of large missiles, American missiles, fired into civilian areas. That doesn't seem to matter to European Union leaders, nor does the fact that the populations of the disputed territories are not only ethnically Russian, but they overwhelmingly want to be part of Russia. Nobody seems to have ever done a history lesson, Glenn. These borders were drawn up by Lenin in order to sort out his own political problems at the time, but the idea that they would ever be in a post-Soviet era, the reasons for battlegrounds, was ludicrous. Even at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, nobody expected Ukraine to go to war with Russia. This conflict has been deliberately fomented, hasn't it? And people are ignoring, they talk about the respect for borders, but they're ignoring the fundamentals of the situation, which is that, in fact, most of Ukraine, that part of Ukraine is overwhelmingly Russian and wishes to be so. Johnny said when he was in Kiev before the war started, he only heard Russian being spoken. In other words, it's a fabricated conflict that has human cost.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem, because it would have been great if there would never have been a coup in 2014. All these people would be alive, and of course, Ukraine would also have had its actual territories, including Crimea, as this was a reaction by Russia. Now, but it wasn't only the threat to Russia comes from is twofold. The first is obviously having NATO encroach on the Russian border and position itself as it did after the coup, establish all the CIA bases along the Russian borders. This is not acceptable, and also, as you mentioned, the Russian minorities living in Ukraine as well. This was always also problematic. Now, in Ukraine, they had cultural autonomy. That is, they had certain language rights and everything. But when the West aligned itself with this very far right, some of them even fascist groups, in 2014, the first thing the new parliament did was to try to pass a law on banning the Russian language. Now, the problem here is suddenly you revoke the cultural autonomy for Donbass and, for all Ukrainians. And at this point, you then saw the people in Donbass believing that they had to challenge or get at least some political autonomy so they can preserve some other rights. And this is what the Russians supported as well. Now, one doesn't even have to agree with what Russia did, but to reject or ignore a lot of the problems and the grievances which they had in eastern Ukraine is quite ridiculous. We don't give them any agency. whenever they be suffering because of our policies, we just dismiss it as, oh, well, the stooges of Russia, they're pro-Russians, they're, the real Ukrainians are the ones who just want to go to the West and to cut all ties with Russia. But this is simply not the reality. And this is why a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the West has been so fake. I mean, you can prove from 1991 to 2014 that every single polling showed that that the majority of Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO, and still we have a narrative which just defies all evidence and all truth. It's quite disappointing.
Well, much more than disappointing. It's absolutely tragic for the citizens involved, and it's indicative of the extent to which narratives in the West are fabricated, not just on Ukraine, but I mean the hypocrisy over the two situations with the Ukraine on the one hand and what's happening in Palestine on the other is absolutely glaring. The Hungarian Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, not sure if I pronounced that right, commented on this ban. What a fantastic response they have come up with. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but it feels like being in a kindergarten. And I think he's absolutely right. Orban, of course, is quite close to Donald Trump. And Trump has said he'll end the war possibly before even getting in the Oval Office while still president-elect. He met Zelensky on the fringes of the Republican National Convention the other day, and Zelensky's trying to make this a non-partisan issue so that whoever wins the election, he continues to get his dosh. We're in a pretty sorry state when we put our trust in Donald Trump, but at the moment on the world stage, he looks about just the best bet for peace, doesn't he?
Yeah, this is a very sad state as well, that probably the future of the world might depend on none other than Donald Trump. This is a interesting situation to be in, but it is a very partisan issue. If you see not just Trump's position on Ukraine, but the fact that it shows J.D. Vance as VP, it's another indication that he's ready to accept the reality that this war has been lost, and look for some political settlement. This is why what the EU is doing not only is deeply immoral, but it's also an exercise in self-harm, because the EU is making itself less and less relevant, and because there will have to be negotiations, and Ukraine has lost. So the proxy war is over, and by the EU taking this position, not even feeling out the possibility for diplomacy, it's they're making themselves completely irrelevant. And just back to what you said, all the things they're doing, they're always referring to helping Ukraine. They're doing it for Ukraine. They're pro-Ukrainians. This is the good versus evil narrative they always take, but it's so fraudulent at its core. Because everything they did, they toppled the government, no support from Ukrainians. They pushed this anti-terrorist operation against Eastern Ukrainians, killing 14,000 of them. Also not supported by the Ukrainians. The election of Zelensky, he ran on a peace platform. The Americans were able to overturn that. They claimed they did it for Ukrainians, so they would have to capitulate to Russia. All the time, this constant policies pushed by NATO. They always go against the majority of will of the Ukrainians, and they're always doing it in the name of Ukrainians. I mean, even now, we're talking about helping Ukraine by possibly starting to deport Ukrainian refugees to fill the trenches. It's becoming quite grotesque. And at least, one of the refreshing thing about Donald Trump is he's brutally honest, and I wish we should be more honest about what we're doing. That is, we're using Ukrainians as a proxy, and we're not counting the dead because they're not our young men. And it's quite despicable.
Oh, absolutely. That despicable ghoul, Lindsey Graham, masquerading as a senator, said, isn't it wonderful? We can fight Russia without having to lose a single soldier. General Sir Rowley Walker, the new head of the army here in Britain has talked about a war going on for another 5 years with 1.5 million casualties. These are absolutely epic numbers, and nobody seems to be aware of the fact that Hitler couldn't beat Russia, and nor could Napoleon. So what chance has Zelensky got? It beggars belief, frankly, the depth of the ignorance. But Germany now plans to halve military aid to Ukraine. Is that going to make any difference, Glenn, or will it be made up by other countries? Because, of course, NATO were falling over themselves to fill Zelensky's pockets with weapons and money just over a week ago.
Well, it's hard to make predictions now because there's so much political upheaval across the West. Part of this political upheaval is, of course, caused by the fact that the countries very poorly defend their national interests. And, this war has been a disaster. Of course, there's other reasons behind upheaval as well. But obviously, the Germans are pouring in a lot of weapons, but it can be made up by, the French or the Brits or the Americans. So it all depends what's happening in these other countries as well. I don't think it really matters that much elections anymore in Europe in terms of the foreign policy. They will continue the same policies. I think if you want to look for real change, it's going to have to come from Washington. As in Europe now, I think we're just on autopilot. We're not questioning anything. It's just this war has to be won on the battlefield, but we're losing the war. So the only solution we have is further and further escalation. And exactly because Russia is winning, they don't want to have too much escalation. So they don't want to direct conflict with NATO. So they have allowed NATO to step over a lot of the red lines. Now, the big pressure in Moscow now is that this is emboldening NATO. They have to now make a point. But the lesson here in Europe is the exact opposite. We're saying, we can step over all of Russia's red line. They're not doing anything about it. So why not strike deep inside Russia? Why should we have any limitations? Let's just, effectively fight deeper and deeper into Russia. This is a complete madness. And but everyone's part of this cult now. It's all this war between good and evil. We're all gonna. We can only envision victory on the battlefield, even though no one actually defined what victory means. If Russia considers, NATO marching into Crimea as being an existential threat, and they would use nuclear weapons before they allow this to happen, what exactly do we define victory over Russia as? You look at who they elected now. The new foreign policy chief now, who's been elected in the European Union, has called for breaking up Russia into smaller pieces.
Right.
This is callous. This is what the EU has become. It's horrific, and they speak with such virtue and like they have this great values, and they're standing on some moral high horse. It's complete insanity. It's wild that we're in this situation.
Glenn Diesen, I wish we could end on a more positive note, but that's the reality of the situation. We can only really hope for some kind of general enlightenment, if I may say so, because with this current crop of politicians, we're absolutely doomed. Ursula von der Leyen seems to think that she can dictate European foreign policy, but when somebody who people have actually voted for, like Orban, does so, then everybody's up in arms. It's another indication of just how inverted our world has become. Thank you so much for joining me today, Glenn Diesen.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
We're going to take a very short break now, and when we come back, I'll be joined by Professor Tony Hall, Emeritus Professor from the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, and we'll be looking at some of the protests against Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington and saying, could this be the start of a global uprising in favour of international law and against the barbarian murderers in Gaza? We'll be right back.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.